Between 1941 and 1943, German anti-tank guns inspired a quiet confidence within the Wehrmacht. On paper, they were among the most formidable weapons in Europe. Penetration tables were precise. Caliber figures were reassuring. In controlled tests, steel plates shattered at measured distances, struck at perfect angles, under clean skies. Engineers, officers, and planners believed they had solved the problem of enemy armor before it could become decisive. The belief was not irrational. The 50mm and later the 75mm anti-tank guns showed impressive results on test ranges from Kummersdorf to Meppen against stationary targets. Their shells punched through armor with mathematical reliability. Reports circulated through command staffs with neat columns of numbers, millimeters penetrated, meters achieved, probabilities calculated. War, in those documents, appeared predictable, manageable, almost orderly. But battlefields are not test ranges. The irony revealed itself slowly, then all at once. On the Eastern Front, guns sank into mud before firing a shot. In Normandy, hedgerows stole visibility and angles. Smoke obscured silhouettes. Tanks appeared not broadside, but oblique, fleeting, half seen through dust and fire. The clean geometry of the firing tables dissolved the moment the first shell missed. Gun crews felt the gap between theory and reality more sharply than anyone else. They fought exhaustion, cold, fear, and poor footing while trying to align weapons designed for ideal ground. A slight slope altered penetration. Wet soil shifted trails. A second's hesitation meant death. What worked flawlessly in peacetime trials now depended on luck, nerve, and terrain no engineer could control. The contrast became undeniable. Penetration figures assumed perfect impact angles. Combat delivered glancing blows. Test armor was static. Enemy tanks moved unpredictably, firing back. The numbers had never lied, but they had never told the whole truth either. Precision, it turned out, was fragile. By 1943, reports from the front painted a different picture. Guns that should have stopped armor failed when conditions strayed from the ideal. The revelation was not that the weapons were useless, but that theory alone was insufficient. War punished assumptions, and as German planners struggled to adapt elsewhere, others were drawing very different conclusions about how future weapons would have to fight not on paper, but in chaos. For years, military doctrine reduced anti-tank combat to a single comforting equation. Penetration equaled effectiveness. If a shell could pierce armor at a given range, victory seemed assured. Manuals taught it. Tables confirmed it. In classrooms and briefings, war was rendered as a problem of mathematics, solved with the right caliber and sufficient velocity. The shock came at the moment of contact. A tank in motion was not a steel plate on a stand. It lurched forward, altered course, disappeared behind folds of ground, and reappeared without warning. Under fire, distances collapsed or stretched beyond recognition. A target that looked close was far. One that seemed broad suddenly narrowed. The problem was no longer penetration, but contact. The irony was brutal. The gun could penetrate the armor if it hit, but hitting required clarity that rarely existed. Smoke drifted across fields. Dust clouds rose with every impact. Engines roared. Drowning shouted commands. Crews had seconds to act, often less. The carefully calculated range markers on the sight meant little when the tank was already moving again. Struggle defined these moments. Range estimation faltered as terrain distorted perspective. Visibility vanished behind explosions and burning vehicles. Stress tightened hands and narrowed vision. Men fired not when conditions were optimal, but when fear demanded action. Many shots were hurried, reactive, imprecise. Survival, not accuracy, became the priority. The human reality was stark. After-action reports revealed what firing tables never could. Crews often fired blindly, trusting volume and timing more than aim. Ammunition was expended to keep tanks at bay, not always to destroy them. The gun's theoretical capability mattered less than the crew's ability to function amid chaos. The revelation settled slowly but decisively. Numbers did not fight wars. Men did frightened, exhausted, imperfect men. And while engineers refined equations, the battlefield continued to expose the limits of certainty. Some armies would accept this truth and adapt their weapons accordingly. Others would cling to their numbers, unaware that the nature of armored combat was already shifting beneath their feet. On the battlefield, Anti-tank guns did not occupy the rear or the safety of prepared positions. They were pushed forward close to the line of contact, where armor was expected to break through. There, they waited in shallow pits, their silhouettes low, their crews exposed. The shock was not in their presence, but in their vulnerability. These weapons were meant to stop tanks, yet they lived where tanks could see them first. Doctrine offered reassurance. Camouflage, concealment, and discipline would provide protection. Crews were trained to remain still, to hold fire until the moment was right. Nets were draped carefully. Earth was packed tight around wheels and trails. If the gun did not move, it would not be noticed. If it was not noticed, it would survive. The irony was built into the weapon itself. Its power depended on immobility. To fire accurately, the gun had to be stable. To penetrate armor, it had to be aligned, braced, unmoving. But stillness was also its greatest weakness. Once fired, the muzzle blast betrayed it instantly. Dust erupted. Smoke marked the position like a signal flare. The struggle that followed was brutally brief. Tanks returned fire with high-explosive shells designed not for precision, but for annihilation. Machine guns swept the area. Artillery followed. A position that had taken hours to prepare could be destroyed in seconds. Crews had little time to withdraw. Often, there was no time at all. What emerged was a grim revelation. The moment a gun succeeded when it struck its target, when a tank burned, it signed its own death warrant. Success drew attention. Attention brought fire. The very act of stopping armor ensured retaliation. Reports from both fronts echoed the same pattern. Anti-tank crews achieved their kills early, then vanished from the record. Their weapons worked, but only once. War did not reward stationary excellence for long. As armies absorbed this lesson, some began searching for a way to keep the gun's power without its fatal stillness. And in workshops, far from the front, a different solution was already taking shape. German anti-tank doctrine was built on a particular vision of war. Engagements would be controlled, deliberate, and short. Armor would advance along predictable routes. Guns would be positioned in depth, striking decisively before withdrawing or repositioning. In theory, speed and coordination would prevent prolonged exposure. The belief was not merely technical, it was philosophical. War, as imagined in planning rooms, could be shaped. The shock came when that vision collapsed. Blitzkrieg, once defined by momentum and surprise, slowed under the weight of distance and resistance. On the Eastern Front, advances stretched supply lines thin. In the West, Allied forces returned with numbers, air superiority, and persistence. The war became attritional, measured not in days, but in months of grinding pressure. The controlled engagement gave way to continuous contact. Irony emerged in the design of the weapons themselves. Anti-tank guns optimized for ambush now faced waves of armor rather than isolated breakthroughs. Instead of striking and relocating, crews were forced to hold positions against repeated attacks. The very features that made the guns lethal in brief encounters, precision, stability, concealment, offered little protection against massed force. The struggle was one of mobility. Towed guns required time, manpower, and open ground to move. Under fire, relocation became impossible. Horses and trucks could not reach forward positions once artillery and aircraft dominated the skies. A weapon meant to shift with the battlefield found itself rooted in place, overtaken by events. Reports from commanders reflected growing unease. Guns arrived too late or could not withdraw at all. Crews were lost not because they failed, but because they were asked to perform a role the battlefield no longer permitted. Doctrine, once a guide, had become a constraint. The revelation was unavoidable. German anti-tank weapons had been designed for a war that no longer existed. They remained powerful, but power without adaptability was insufficient. The enemy had changed its methods, and the environment had changed with them. As German planners struggled to reconcile theory with reality, others were abandoning towed solutions altogether. They sought a way to give firepower its freedom back by mounting the gun on something that could move, survive, and fight on its own terms. The response to thicker armor was predictable: larger calibers. As Allied tanks grew heavier, German guns followed the same path. The 75mm and 88mm delivered the penetration earlier weapons lacked. At range, they could shatter armor with authority. On firing tables, The problem seemed solved once again. The shock lay in what that power demanded in return. The belief was that crews would hold their ground. Heavier guns were meant to anchor defensive lines, to dominate approaches and deny armor its freedom of movement. They were not expected to withdraw often. Strength, in this thinking, was permanence. A gun that could not be ignored would not need to retreat. The irony was unforgiving. Increased weight reduced every option except endurance. Larger guns required more men to serve them, more animals or vehicles to move them, and more time to emplace. Once deployed, they became fixtures of the terrain. When the moment came to move, there was rarely a moment to spare. The struggle unfolded at ground level. Mud swallowed wheels. Horses collapsed under shellfire. Tractors broke down or never arrived. Crews strained against steel and earth, trying to shift tons of metal while artillery closed in. What theory described as relocation became a desperate effort measured in meters, not miles. The turning point came under fire. Once the enemy identified a heavy gun, withdrawal was nearly impossible. The recoil pit that stabilized the weapon also trapped it. Trails were buried. Ammunition lay scattered. The decision to abandon the gun often came too late. Many crews chose to fight beside it instead, knowing escape was no longer an option. The revelation was stark and final. Power without mobility was a trap. The gun could kill tanks, but it could not save itself. In gaining the ability to destroy anything in front of it, it surrendered the ability to leave. This lesson did not go unnoticed. Some would cling to brute force, doubling down on weight and caliber. Others began asking a different question. What if the gun did not have to be moved at all because it could move itself? The moment an anti-tank gun revealed itself, the balance of power shifted instantly. Smoke from the muzzle, dust from the recoil, the sharp crack of firing each served as an unmistakable signal. The shock was not in being seen, but in how quickly the response came. What had been an ambush became a countdown. Crews believed they would have time. Doctrine suggested a rhythm. Fire, observe, correct, fire again. On training grounds, this sequence felt natural, almost assured. The expectation was that precision would buy seconds, and seconds would buy survival. In combat, that assumption rarely survived the first exchange. The irony was cruel. Most crews received only one shot. If it struck, the tank burned, and every enemy weapon nearby turned toward the gun's position. If it missed, the result was often the same. The tank did not need to see the gun clearly. It needed only to know where the shot had come from. The struggle that followed was violent and one-sided. Machine guns stitched the ground, denying movement. High explosive shells followed, tearing apart gun shields and throwing crews back into the earth. Artillery observers, alerted by radio or instinct, added weight to the response. A single anti-tank position could be smothered in fire within moments. Accounts from surviving crewmen described the same sequence. The first round was calm. The second was rushed, if it came at all. Then the world narrowed to fragments, shrapnel, noise, pressure. Training dissolved. Decisions became instinctive. Survival depended less on skill than on chance. The revelation was not about courage or failure. It was structural. Anti-tank combat was asymmetrical and unforgiving. The gun needed stillness and concealment. The tank needed only to detect and respond. One possessed mobility, armor, and firepower. The other relied on a single moment of surprise. By late 1943, the lesson was clear across every front. Towed guns could destroy tanks, but tanks would usually destroy the guns in return. The exchange was uneven and increasingly unsustainable. As this reality hardened into doctrine, armies began to reconsider the entire relationship between gun and tank, and the next answer would blur the line between the two. In real battles, vision was never stable. The struggle began with the air itself. Dust rose from every movement, tracks grinding soil into clouds that lingered and thickened. Smoke drifted from burning vehicles, ruptured fuel tanks, and artillery strikes just beyond sight. What crews thought they saw often vanished seconds later. The battlefield did not merely challenge perception, it distorted it. Under these conditions, judgment faltered. Distances became guesses. Silhouettes dissolved into shadows. A tank that appeared stationary was often moving. One that seemed exposed was already angling away. The gunner's sight, so carefully calibrated, was now framed by haze and vibration. Precision demanded clarity, and clarity was the first casualty of sustained combat. The irony was unmistakable. Accuracy collapsed precisely when it mattered most. Anti-tank guns were engineered for exactness, fine adjustments, measured leads, controlled fire. But the environment stripped those advantages away. Crews fired through smoke they could not see past, trusting instinct over optics. The very conditions that made armor vulnerable also made hitting it uncertain. Pressure compounded every weakness. Artillery did not need to destroy the gun to neutralize it. Near misses were enough. Explosions showered positions with earth and fragments, forcing crews to keep their heads down. Infantry closed in under covering fire, their rifles and machine guns sweeping gun pits relentlessly. Suppression became a weapon in itself. Reports from the front repeatedly described the same pattern. Guns were intact, crews alive, ammunition available, and yet the position was combat ineffective. Men could not stand, could not see, could not aim. Every attempt to re-engage invited immediate retaliation. The weapon existed, but its function was denied. The human toll was cumulative. Noise shattered concentration. Concussion dulled reaction time. Fatigue narrowed perception to the immediate and the urgent. Crews learned to fire quickly, not accurately, to seize fleeting chances before being forced back into cover. The battlefield rewarded speed and volume, not careful calculation. This was the deeper revelation. Precision weapons required an environment that war itself refused to provide. The more intense the fighting became, the less useful theoretical accuracy proved to be. Firepower mattered, but so did the ability to remain operational under constant pressure. A gun that could not see, could not fight, no matter how powerful it was. As the war progressed, armies adjusted their expectations. Anti-tank guns were no longer judged solely by penetration or range, but by survivability under suppression. Could the weapon continue firing when blinded? Could it endure bombardment and still respond? Increasingly, the answer was no. The battlefield had made its verdict clear. Smoke, dust, and suppression did not merely complicate combat, they reshaped it. Precision alone was insufficient. Adaptability, protection, and endurance were becoming decisive. And in response to that verdict, designers and commanders alike began to imagine a different kind of solution, one that could see through chaos, move under fire, and fight without waiting for perfect conditions. German doctrine assumed anti-armor positions would not have to operate alone. Infantry screens were supposed to form a protective layer watching the flanks, keeping pressure away, and breaking up approaches before they reached the line. On paper, it looked reliable. The heavy teams focused on armor, while the infantry handled the rest. The reality shifted the moment those screens collapsed. Under sustained bombardment and air pressure, infantry units were often pinned down long before armor arrived. Communication lines broke. Smoke and confusion scattered cohesion. When the advance finally reached the position, the troops meant to protect it were already fighting just to stay organized. That was when the weakness became obvious. Once infantry protection failed, the position became isolated. Its effective coverage narrowed. Openings appeared along the sides and rear. What had been a defended strongpoint turned into a fixed point, easy to locate, harder to protect, and increasingly vulnerable. The struggle that followed was close and unforgiving. Enemy elements closed the distance under covering pressure, using folds in the ground and broken vegetation for concealment. Anti-armor crews, trained for long-range work, were forced into a kind of fighting they weren't built for. Orders dissolved into instinct. The position once the center of the defense became something to work around rather than a place to hold. The turning point wasn't just power, it was coordination. Armor did not move alone. It moved with infantry, artillery, and air support working together. Each piece covered the weaknesses of the others. Static defenses couldn't match that flexibility. Once engaged, they were pressured from multiple directions at once. By 1944, the lesson was undeniable. Anti-armor positions could not survive in isolation. Effectiveness depended on a network mobility, protection, coordination, and support arriving at the right moment. As armies absorbed that reality, the search for a new answer intensified, one that could keep pace, endure pressure, and fight as part of a moving system. On paper, the numbers still looked reassuring. Tanks were being destroyed. Burned-out hulks marked fields and roadways. After-action reports recorded confirmed kills, distances, calibers. The shock was not in the absence of success, but in its timing. The tanks were stopped after they had already done their work. Again and again, Anti-tank guns engaged armor only once breakthroughs had occurred. Forward positions were overrun, flanks turned, command posts threatened. The guns fought bravely, often effectively, but always in reaction. They were responding to momentum rather than shaping it. By the time they fired, the situation had already shifted. The irony cut deep. Tactical success failed to translate into strategic effect. A tank destroyed at the edge of a village did not undo the loss of the village itself. A column halted after crossing a river did not restore the line it had already broken. The gun performed its task, yet the battle continued to move past it. The struggle lay in scale and tempo. Armored offensives were not single machines advancing alone. They were systems in motion. Tanks pressed forward while others replaced them. Supply columns followed. Infantry secured ground. Destroying one vehicle slowed nothing if 10 more remained in motion. The gun could win its duel and still lose the fight. Reports from commanders reflected growing frustration. Crews achieved kills under desperate conditions, only to be bypassed or surrounded hours later. The front moved faster than the guns could be redeployed. Victory at the point of contact meant little if the line itself had already shifted miles away. This was the revelation that reshaped thinking across every front. The battlefield now moved at a speed static defenses could not match. Firepower alone could not compensate for immobility. The gun arrived at decisive moments too late, not because it lacked power, but because it lacked presence at the right time. Armies that adapted did so by integrating firepower with movement. They placed guns on mobile platforms, armored them, and allowed them to fight alongside the advance rather than behind it. Those that did not were left reacting to events they could no longer control. By late 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Anti-tank guns could still kill tanks, but killing tanks was no longer enough. War had become a contest of tempo, coordination, and adaptability. And as German planners struggled to reconcile their kill counts with their losses, the answer they had once dismissed was already proving itself on other fronts, quietly, relentlessly, and at speed. The contrast became impossible to ignore. On the same battlefields where towed anti-tank guns were being overrun or silenced, a different kind of weapon was surviving and succeeding. Self-propelled guns and tank destroyers moved with the fight. They arrived where pressure was greatest, fired, withdrew, and reappeared elsewhere. The shock was not that they destroyed tanks, but that they endured. These vehicles reversed the logic of static defense. Instead of waiting for armor to arrive, they went to meet it. Mounted on tracked or wheeled chassis, their guns retained the same lethality as their towed counterparts, but with a critical difference. They could relocate under fire. When spotted, they moved. When threatened, they withdrew. Mobility became not a luxury, but a form of armor. The irony was profound. For years, doctrine had treated mobility as secondary to firepower. Now it was mobility that preserved firepower. A gun that could move could fight again. A gun that could not was a single-use weapon. Survivability no longer depended on concealment alone, but on the ability to change position faster than the enemy could respond. The turning point unfolded unevenly. Allied forces, particularly the Americans and Soviets, embraced mobile anti-tank solutions early and in large numbers. Tank destroyer battalions and self-propelled guns were integrated into maneuver formations, fighting alongside armor and infantry. They shared the risks and the protection of combined arms warfare. German forces recognized the shift, but too late and too inconsistently. Vehicles like the Marder and later the Jagdpanzer series offered formidable firepower, yet they were introduced under pressure in limited numbers and often with compromised protection. They solved the problem of movement, but not always the problem of sustainability. Still, the battlefield rewarded the concept. Mobile guns could choose when to fight. They could disengage before artillery arrived. They could exploit fleeting opportunities and abandon hopeless positions. Where towed guns were fixed points, self-propelled weapons were variables harder to predict, harder to destroy. Reports reflected the difference clearly. Units equipped with mobile firepower reported higher survival rates, greater flexibility, and sustained effectiveness across multiple engagements. The weapon was no longer tied to the ground it defended. It had become part of the maneuver itself. The revelation was decisive. Adaptation had arrived, but for some, it arrived too late. Years of investment in static doctrine could not be undone quickly. Factories, training programs, and organizational structures lagged behind the battlefield's demands. What should have been a transformation became an improvisation. By the final years of the war, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Static anti-tank guns, once the backbone of defense, were increasingly sidelined or relegated to secondary roles. The future belonged to weapons that could move, survive, and fight repeatedly in a fluid environment. The lesson carried a quiet finality. War does not reward perfection in isolation. It rewards systems that can adapt under pressure. Firepower matters, but only if it arrives in time, and only if it lives long enough to matter again. And as the smoke cleared, the anti-tank gun's story ended not in failure, but in transformation. Its legacy absorbed into a new form of warfare that no longer waited for the enemy to come. As the war turned against Germany, one belief remained stubbornly intact. More penetration would solve everything. Thicker armor was met with larger calibers, longer barrels, heavier shells, higher muzzle velocity. Each new gun promised to restore balance, to reclaim dominance through technical superiority. The logic felt familiar, almost comforting. If the enemy had grown stronger, the answer was simply to strike harder. The shock was that this escalation did not reverse the trend, it accelerated the cost. Bigger guns did not operate in a vacuum. Their firing signatures were unmistakable. Their recoil shook the ground. Their blast revealed positions instantly. What they gained in destructive power, they lost in discretion. The battlefield responded accordingly. Counterfire grew heavier and faster. Artillery observers prioritized large-caliber guns the moment they were identified. Aircraft were vectored toward them. Tanks, infantry, and mortars converged with urgency. A weapon designed to dominate space instead drew attention to itself, becoming a focal point for overwhelming retaliation. The irony was devastating. Each upgrade shortened the lifespan of the crew meant to operate it. Heavier guns required more time to deploy, more men to serve, and more effort to supply. They were slower to move and harder to conceal. When engaged, they offered little chance of escape. The very attributes that made them fearsome also made them fatal. Loss reports told the story with brutal clarity. Crews of the most powerful guns suffered disproportionately high casualties. Their weapons worked sometimes spectacularly, but survival rates declined. A gun that could kill anything in front of it could not outlive the fire it attracted. Victory at the point of impact came at the cost of permanence. The turning point arrived quietly, buried in statistics rather than headlines. Production increased, but effective strength did not. More guns entered service, yet fewer crews returned. The exchange rate worsened. Each tank destroyed required an unsustainable investment of men and material. The balance had tipped from effectiveness to attrition, and Germany could not afford attrition. This was the deeper revelation. Escalation had limits. Firepower alone could not overcome systemic disadvantage. Bigger guns did not address the fundamental problems of mobility, protection, and integration. They solved yesterday's problem while exposing tomorrow's vulnerability. By the final years of the war, the pattern was unmistakable. Each new weapon arrived heavier, deadlier, and less survivable than the last. Technical brilliance could not compensate for strategic exhaustion. The battlefield punished solutions that ignored context, no matter how impressive they appeared in isolation. Germany did not lose because its guns were weak. It lost because strength was applied without adaptability. The fixation on penetration blinded planners to the realities of modern, combined warfare. Power became a substitute for flexibility, and escalation replaced evolution. In the end, the guns did exactly what they were designed to do. They destroyed armor. What they could not do was change the course of a war that no longer rewarded raw force alone. And as the fighting drew to a close, the lesson stood in silence among the wreckage. When escalation becomes the only answer, it is already too late. By the later stages of the war, the shock was no longer confined to individual engagements. It spread across entire fronts. Allied forces had learned how to fight together: armor, infantry, artillery, and aircraft, moving as a single system. Against this coordination, fixed defenses began to collapse with unsettling speed. What once held ground now merely delayed the inevitable. The irony was sharp. German weapons had reached extraordinary levels of technical excellence. Their guns were powerful, precise, and often superior in raw performance to anything facing them. Yet excellence in isolation meant little. Each component of the Allied advance compensated for the weaknesses of the others. Where one element faltered, another filled the gap. Precision met pressure, and pressure prevailed. The battlefield no longer allowed pauses. Artillery suppressed before guns could engage. Aircraft isolated positions before infantry arrived. Tanks advanced not as lone targets, but under layers of protection. Static anti-tank guns found themselves attacked from above, flanked from the sides, and overwhelmed from the front, often simultaneously. This marked the turning point. Defensive doctrine, built on anticipation and preparation, broke under the tempo of modern war. Positions were bypassed rather than assaulted. Guns waited for tanks that never came, while armor flowed around them toward deeper objectives. The battlefield ceased to revolve around strong points. It became a moving landscape of opportunity and exploitation. Reports from German commanders reflected a growing sense of helplessness. Units fought well, inflicted losses, and held briefly, then found themselves cut off or irrelevant. Firepower remained lethal, but relevance faded. The war had become fluid, and static solutions could not keep pace. The revelation was not merely tactical, but philosophical. War had changed its nature. Success no longer depended on holding ground at all costs, but on shaping movement. Weapons designed to dominate a fixed space were being outmatched by forces designed to control time, coordination, and momentum. This was the quiet triumph of combined arms. No single weapon decided the outcome. It was the integration, the timing of artillery, the reach of air power, the flexibility of armor, the persistence of infantry that proved decisive. Against such cohesion, even the most formidable gun became a temporary obstacle rather than a decisive barrier. By 1945, the verdict was unmistakable. Static anti-tank guns still destroyed tanks. They still fought with courage and skill, but they no longer defined the battle. The battlefield moved too quickly, adapted too fluidly, and struck too broadly for fixed weapons to survive on their own terms. The story of the anti-tank gun was not one of obsolescence, but of displacement. Its role was absorbed into a larger system, mounted, armored, mobile, and coordinated. What failed was not the weapon, but the idea that firepower alone could control a war in motion. And as the guns fell silent, the lesson endured beyond the wreckage. In modern war, survival belongs not to the strongest position, but to the force that can move, adapt, and strike as one. The consequences of static anti-tank warfare were not measured first in lost ground or abandoned positions, but in men. Gun crews bore losses that rarely made headlines. Their work was quiet, their positions often unnamed, their ends abrupt. When a gun was destroyed, its crew was usually destroyed with it. The casualty lists reflected this grim arithmetic. These men occupied one of the most dangerous roles on the battlefield. They fought forward, exposed and stationary, facing an enemy defined by speed, armor, and firepower. The irony was unmistakable. The least mobile soldiers were tasked with stopping the most mobile machines. Escape was not part of the equation. Once engaged, their fate was often sealed. Accounts from the front reveal a pattern of near-total losses. Crews were wiped out by artillery, overrun by infantry, or incinerated by direct hits. Survival depended on factors beyond skill timing, terrain, chance. Replacement rates climbed, but experience vanished. New crews learned under fire, inheriting positions where predecessors had fallen days or even hours earlier. The emotional toll was cumulative. Gun crews knew their odds. They understood that success drew retaliation, that a confirmed kill invited immediate counterfire. Yet they remained at their posts, loading and firing until ordered to withdraw, or until withdrawal was no longer possible. Courage was not absent. It was simply consumed. The irony deepened as the war progressed. As guns grew larger and more powerful, crew survival declined further. Heavier weapons attracted greater attention, heavier counterfire, and more decisive responses. The most formidable positions became the most lethal to occupy. Technical improvement did not protect the men who served it. Reports written in neutral language concealed devastating truths. Position neutralized, gun lost, crew missing. Behind these phrases were bodies buried under collapsed pits, men scattered by blast, names struck quietly from unit rolls. The weapon could be replaced. The crew could not. This was the revelation that emerged too late to change doctrine. The true cost of static anti-tank warfare was not measured in destroyed guns or expended ammunition, but in human lives. Firepower extracted a price paid almost entirely by those who served it closest. As mobile solutions spread, casualty rates shifted. Crews inside armored vehicles survived engagements that would have annihilated towed positions. Protection, even imperfect protection, mattered. Mobility offered not just tactical advantage, but mercy. It gave men a chance to fight again. But for thousands of gun crews, that realization came too late. They fought and died in silence, their sacrifice absorbed into the broader narrative of a war that moved past them. Their weapons performed as designed. The battlefield simply demanded more than those designs could give. In the end, the anti-tank gun's legacy is inseparable from the men who served it. Steel and statistics tell only part of the story. The rest is written in absence, in positions that fell quiet, in guns left unmanned, in the knowledge that the true measure of war is never metal, but men. Those who survived service on anti-tank guns rarely spoke in abstractions. Their memories were concrete mud on hands, ringing ears, the weight of waiting. Fear was not sudden. It accumulated. It grew in the long hours before contact, in the knowledge that when the tanks came, there would be nowhere else to go. Exposure was constant. Inevitability was understood early. Veterans described the gun pit as a place of compression. Space narrowed. Time shortened. Once the position was chosen, the future felt fixed. The weapon promised power, but it did not promise safety. Crews trusted each other more than the steel they served. Survival depended less on equipment than on timing and fortune. The irony was deeply felt. The anti-tank gun was feared by the enemy. Tanks maneuvered cautiously around suspected positions. Columns halted at reports of concealed guns. Yet among the men who served them, trust was conditional. They knew what the weapon could do and what it could not. It could stop a tank. It could not stop what followed. Survivors spoke of the moment after firing, the silence before retaliation, the certainty that came with it. Some recalled seeing shells already inbound before their second round was chambered. Others remembered realizing, with sudden clarity, that the battle had moved beyond them. The gun remained, but the fight had shifted elsewhere. Reputation did not match reality. Training emphasized lethality and discipline, but offered little guidance for withdrawal under fire or survival after detection. The gun's image, dominant, precise, decisive, collapsed under lived experience. What mattered most was not how well it performed in theory, but how briefly it could remain relevant once revealed. This was the battlefield's lesson. Reality defeated reputation. Precision mattered less than endurance. Power mattered less than adaptability. The gun was not a shield. It was an instrument, effective but unforgiving. Those who lived learned to separate confidence from certainty. Some crews adapted instinctively. They fired early and displaced if possible. They avoided perfect shots in favor of survivable ones. Others held to doctrine and paid the price. The battlefield rewarded those who learned quickly and punished those who believed the manuals would protect them. Over time, this knowledge spread informally, passed between crews rather than commands. It shaped behavior more than orders ever could. The men understood what the war demanded before the doctrine acknowledged it. They felt the transition before it was written down. The revelation that endured was simple and unsentimental. Weapons do not decide battles on their own. They exist within conditions that can negate their strengths without diminishing their design. The anti-tank gun was never a failure, but it was never enough. For those who survived, the lesson followed them beyond the war. They remembered not the penetration figures, but the sound of approaching tracks. Not the tables, but the waiting. The battlefield had taught them what theory could not. And as the war ended and the guns fell silent, that lesson remained quiet, uncelebrated, and absolute, ready to shape the next generation of weapons, built not for reputation, but for reality. They built weapons to stop tanks. The battlefield stopped the weapons instead. This was the moral closure written not in doctrine, but in wreckage. German anti-tank guns were conceived with intelligence, tested with rigor, and refined with precision. On paper, they answered every known requirement. They penetrated armor. They reached expected ranges. They delivered decisive force. Yet war did not ask whether they worked in theory. It asked whether they could endure reality. The battlefield punished rigidity first. Guns designed for controlled engagements found themselves dragged into fluid, chaotic fights they were never meant to survive. Doctrine assumed time, visibility, coordination, and protection. Combat removed those assumptions one by one. Smoke erased sightlines. Artillery shattered preparation. Movement dissolved static plans. What remained was exposure. War revealed the limits of optimization. Each refinement narrowed the weapon's usefulness. Greater power increased visibility. Heavier construction reduced mobility. Improved penetration drew faster retaliation. The gun became exceptionally good at a single task and increasingly vulnerable to everything else. Precision hardened into fragility. The deeper failure was not technical, but philosophical. German doctrine trusted that superiority at the point of contact could compensate for disadvantages elsewhere. It assumed that excellence in isolation would impose order on chaos. But modern war did not reward isolated excellence. It rewarded systems networks of movement, protection, communication, and mutual support. Anti-tank guns fought alone too often. When infantry fell back, when artillery shifted, when air power arrived, the gun remained. It could not adapt its role fast enough. It could not retreat when the fight changed shape. Its strength was fixed, and so was its fate. This was the battlefield's final lesson. Weapons are arguments about how war will be fought. When war disagrees, it does not compromise. It corrects violently. The anti-tank gun was not wrong. It was simply late to understand what the war had already become. Other armies learned this sooner. They absorbed firepower into mobile platforms. They armored crews. They treated survivability as a prerequisite for lethality. Firepower that could not persist was treated as expendable. Firepower that could move became decisive. Germany learned the same lesson, but under pressure, with fewer resources, and too much invested in what already existed. Adaptation arrived, but never in time to reverse momentum. The battlefield had moved on while theory tried to catch up. In the end, the anti-tank gun did exactly what it was designed to do. It destroyed tanks. What it could not do was survive the conditions required to destroy enough of them. Its legacy was absorbed into something larger, self-propelled, integrated, and flexible, while its original form faded into history. This is not a story of incompetence or ignorance. It is a story of faith placed too heavily in preparation and not enough in adaptability. War did not punish intelligence. It punished certainty. On paper, they were unstoppable.